This one's going to be a long one, so you might want to bookmark it. Also, feel free to give me your thoughts in the comments. One of the many problems with politics is that we often put things between two poles that we call left and right. And then everyone argues about where to place political parties on that spectrum, even though it's not really that simple. It's funny, if you check Wikipedia, they'll say that left-wing politics is characterized by an emphasis on ideas like freedom, equality, fraternity, rights, progress, reform, and internationalism, while right-wing politics is characterized by an emphasis on notions such as authority, hierarchy, order, duty, tradition, reaction, and nationalism. If you've been paying attention to politics for the last few years, though, it feels like parties on both ends of the supposed spectrum don't consistently align with those values all the time. For example, if you talk to a libertarian, they'll tell you that personal freedom is their single biggest priority. Everyone should be able to do as they like. Maybe they throw in something along the lines of, like, as long as they don't hurt anyone. But they also feel that they owe nobody else the duty to pay taxes to cover shared expenses in society. In fact, if you remember during the COVID lockdowns, the more left-leaning someone was, the more they saw themselves typically having a duty to abide by public health measures, whereas those who saw themselves as more right-leaning were more inclined to suggest that those measures weren't necessary, that they didn't owe anyone anything, and the virus probably wasn't even real. So how can someone know if they're left or right when everything is made up and the points don't matter? Well, the first thing to remember is that any ideology that's popular enough to have a name already has several unscrupulous people who are trying to make a living by subverting it. So one of the things that I like to look for is how much does a political position benefit those who are already very wealthy, particularly if it's at the expense of those who have minimal wealth. With this, though, it is important to remember that ever since humanity moved away from living in a nomadic manner, we've had the problem of people who acquire wealth and use it to the benefit of themselves at the expense of others. And of course, those who enjoy hoarding wealth tend to justify it by pointing out the impressive and lasting inventions that humanity has as a result of wealthy people pouring resources into academia and different types of research and art, though they tend to avoid talking about the ways that rich people have often gained their wealth by causing immeasurable suffering to ensure easy supply of things like tea and rubber. In general, most people will associate the extent to which a politician or political party is beholden to those with insane hordes of wealth with how far to the right a party is. And that tends to line up. You may be saying, but given that most campaigns internationally are funded by a small number of incredibly wealthy people, does that not mean that all of our political parties are right-wing? Yeah, you could definitely come to that conclusion, and I would not tell you that you're wrong. As you may know, much of my content centers on an anti-narcissist perspective. So for me, I go a step beyond looking at the monetary aspects of things, though it is very important. The more you learn about psychology, the more you'll notice behavior patterns. People will often say, "You don't know me well enough to say why I did something," which is often a great way to try and defend unkind behavior by claiming that somehow they had pure motives. The thing is, oftentimes you don't need to know what someone thinks or what their motivation for something was, especially since most people aren't that self-aware. So most of the time, people don't even know why they did something. It just felt good in the moment. Motive is important, but the phrase, "you'll know a tree by its fruit," people think that way for a good reason. For example, the more someone knows who they are and why they do things, the more you're going to see if that person goes on the attack, they're going to be attacking ideas and principles and higher level things like that. They're going to be focused on systems, processes, and prevalent ways of thoughts, rather than just individual people as their enemy or people in a demographic that they don't belong to as their enemy. People who don't know who they are, who don't know why they believe what they believe, are more desperate to fit in and gain identity by belonging in a pre-existing community. So they will attack people. They will attack people who are less like them. They'll set up purity tests to see who belongs, because often people, for some reason, think that they can belong if they ensure that someone else doesn't belong. And that's generally pretty dangerous. This is why, for example, if you look at American politics, the more right-wing a party is, like the Republicans, the more likely they are to use queer people or women who need reproductive care as wedge issues. Whereas Democrats, who I would still argue are quite right-wing, will claim that they're for queer people and for women's rights because they value personal freedom. But they will still often position rural poor whites who live in heavily gerrymandered districts as if they're the enemy and they deserve the hell that the politicians that they're tricked into voting for give them. They don't. Nobody deserves to deal with the mess that rural Americans deal with. Sorry. If you look at someone like Bernie Sanders, you'll rarely see him talk smack about right-wing voters, because his perspective is intersectional. He recognizes that people can be oppressed even if they contribute to their own oppression. At least that's what I assume motivates him. For me, When I look at individual politicians, political commentators, political actors, whatever, I look for signs of selflessness and selfishness. But it can be difficult because if someone is stupid and selfish, they're not hard to spot. But narcissists who are the most selfish that humanity has to offer, or take, they often learn that their innate selfishness is very off-putting. So they'll learn how to mask, how to say the right things and look good while not actually dealing with their own internalized deep sense of shame that motivates them to do all kinds of horrible shit. And with those sorts of people, you'll often only catch occasional flickers of really creepy and manipulative behavior. For example, politicians who are selfless will actually have to learn to talk up the good things that they do while in office, lest people just take those for granted. Whereas selfish politicians will have panels all throughout the summer where they can pretend that they're listening to people as they do theater to justify their self-serving policies that they plan on implementing no matter what anyone says. Just as an example. The nice thing about evaluating politicians and parties in terms of selfishness or narcissism is that the less selfish a party is, the more likely they are to do things because they're practical and good for people, even if they don't directly help the politician. A good example of this is Wab Kinew and the Manitoba NDP. They have announced multiple projects and accomplishments focused on people in rural Manitoba. The people who elected Wab and the Manitoba NDP are largely in urban centers in Manitoba and in the north. But Wab hasn't set out to only benefit people in ridings that voted for his party. The Manitoba NDP have also invested a great deal in healthcare, and while they haven't perfected things, they have still gone leaps and bounds ahead of where the progressive conservatives are, of where the progressive conservatives were when they were in charge. If you look at Carney's Liberal government so far, there's a lot of mixed signals. On the one hand, during the campaign, of the three major candidates, he attacked his opponents the least, which I took as a good sign. But some of the first bills put forward did things like making it easier for the government to fast track resource extraction projects that they felt were necessary and potentially bypass certain troublesome environmental regulations. We'll ultimately have to see what the fruits of all that is, but a lot of people, myself including, are hesitant to think that this is a good idea. And I realize that by some people's standards, that may seem like not an extreme enough thing to say, but whatever, fuck off, leave me alone. At the same time, for me, it's a little bit difficult to judge what's going on right now because internationally, capitalism is very much currently eating its tail and creating a great deal of chaos. And in general, the liberals tend to be the sort of party that is much easier to criticize in hindsight because they tend to talk a good game and often deliver at least some of what they promise, but really you only know for sure that they didn't deliver on other things that were important once, you're well past the point where you could possibly pressure them to do the right thing, like with election reform. Moving to the most selfish pole in Canadian politics, you have people like Danielle Smith and Doug Ford, the sort of people who make claims that they're going to improve things, yet keep having people blow whistles on the fact that they keep doing self-serving things and they're not even really aiming to have stable governments. They keep doing things that require the federal and municipal governments to basically pick up the slack because the provincial government keeps abdicating their responsibilities and they're really more focused on awarding lucrative contracts to their supporters. Realistically, if we had a majority of selfless people in elected office, we could have amazing things happen, assuming that they were also competent. As a society, we spend so much time, money, and other resources on padding the egos of people who were either born into extreme wealth or who are simply naturally very comfortable with taking advantage of others and profiting from their work and not paying them fairly based on how much money they generate. So for me, as someone who values ideas that are generally associated with left-wing political positions, like bodily autonomy, wealth equality, access to food and shelter for all, weekends, non-exploitative working conditions, free and fair elections, individual freedoms, and self-determination and equitable treatment for all, when I'm trying to figure out if someone shares my values, I don't actually listen for them to say that they do, because the fact is most people will say that they agree with probably most of the values that I listen. What would actually make me think of someone as a good person to support? I'm looking for signs that they themselves value selflessness and that they do not feel entitled or a strong sense of desire to control or limit others. How comfortable are they with someone being wrong without feeling a need to attack them? How kind are they to others that they can't gain anything from? Do they care more about winning at all costs, or do they resist the urge to win via dishonesty and misinformation? The fact is that when we're children, we have to be taught to think of others' needs because the brain of a child is still developing and their own needs tend to feel very pressing, especially given how little they understand of how the world works. As we get older, ideally, the more we understand how the world works and the more we figure out how to feel safe ourselves, even if we're still keenly aware that there are dangers around us. The fact is, people who feel safe and who are well practiced in selflessness tend to be the best leaders, though they often don't think that they should be leading because they don't want to. Speaking as a disabled neurodivergent gay man, there's often this myth in progressive spaces that the solution to all of our problems is that we need to find the most oppressed voice and put them in charge, and that'll fix everything. And part of the reason for that is because often people who experience oppression sometimes are more inclined to want to prevent others from having to struggle the way that they did. But that is not always how things work out. Sometimes, when people experience oppression, they can get the idea that they need to make sure that they're not being oppressed and do nothing to protect anyone else. Lack of a sense of safety is actually a major reason why oppression happens. And it's counterintuitive, but it can be very effectively fought by refusing to work for the oppression of others. And politicians won't tell you that because they want you to think that the solution is that you need to oppress someone else. People vote for people who give them an enemy, unfortunately. Which is not to say that I'm an absolute pacifist. The thing is, though, othering people, even your enemies, even people whose biology or ideology isn't very similar to yours, is generally a sign that you're not someone who ought to want to lead right now, even if you do. Really, if you're big on othering people, you're not fit to lead. Pursuing selflessness does not mean adopting false niceness or even being excessively kind, but it does mean that we need to pick our battles carefully and focus on those who do the most harm and be careful of making unnecessary enemies. Selflessness is directly tied to your ability to like yourself without needing that to come at anyone else's expense.